I remember the exact shade of the sky the day my son was told he wouldn't amount to much. It was the kind of pale gray that made you think the sun had given up on us. I remember the sound of cafeteria trays clattering, laughter echoing off tiled walls, the unmistakable cruelty of children who hadn't yet learned that words can leave scars deeper than fists. He was 13. Thin, a ruin server thin, quiet. His hands trembled when he held a pencil. But not from weakness, from pressure, from carrying expectations that were never spoken, only implied. That was the day he came home with blood on his lip and silence in his throat. That was the day I decided I would build him a fortress, not made of stone, but of belief. His name is Aiden, and they laughed at him. Not just the kids, not just the ones who didn't know better, but the adults too. The ones who should have, teachers who rolled their eyes when he stumbled on a word, coaches who called him soft because he preferred sketchbooks to soccer balls. Even family. My brother Kevin, he once had a on, the golden one, once said during dinner, loud enough for Aiden to hear. Boys like that don't survive the real world. They get eaten. I looked at my son, then head down, spoon frozen midair, and knew I had two choices. Stay quiet like I always did, or teach my son that dignity doesn't need permission. I chose the second, but not in loud declarations, not in dramatic confrontations. I chose it in early mornings and quiet talks, in the way I started putting notes in his lunchbox with quotes from men who were told no and made history anyway. Lincoln, Carney never read fiction. Carnegie, Win, Baldwin, Ishrani Kinosun, Edison Nonor. I chose it in the way I clapped the loudest when he brought home a drawing, even if it was just a shaded cube. I chose it in the way I stopped waiting for my family to approve of him. I stopped shrinking his spirit to fit their smallness, because they didn't see it. They didn't see the fire in him. But I did. Aiden was different, and different terrifies the mediocre. He never fought back the way they wanted him to, never shouted, never lashed out. He absorbed. He observed. He on. He wrote. I once found a journal under his mattress filled with short entries. Not complaints, not dreams, just truths. Truths like, Kane, I don't think they hate me. I think they don't know how to treat someone they don't understand. And God, that line wrecked me. Because he wasn't broken. He wasn't less, and he was just building his wings in a world that only celebrates birds who already fly. The turning point came the night of his freshman talent show. He didn't tell anyone he signed up. He worked on a monologue alone in his room for weeks. I'd hear muffled rehearsals through the door. I didn't press. I let him own it. When the night came, he walked onto that stage in a wrinkled dress shirt and trembling hands, and stood in front of the very kids who once stuffed his locker with insults. And then he spoke. There's a kind of silence that isn't peaceful. It's the kind of silence that wraps around your throat like a leash. That was my silence. The auditorium went quiet, not out of respect, out of confusion. They didn't expect it from him. They didn't think he had a voice worth hearing. But then he kept going. He talked about what it felt like to be invisible in a room full of eyes, what it meant to be kind in a world that rewards cruelty, what it meant to be soft in a home that demanded armor. His voice wavered, cracked, but never stopped. I remember looking at Kevin's son in the front row, the one who once shoved Aiden into a locker, and seeing his mouth slightly open, shocked. Because Aiden wasn't apologizing. He wasn't asking to be accepted. He was taking up space. That night changed everything. Not for the world, not yet, but for Aiden. That was the night he stopped shrinking, stopped folding his shoulders inward like he was trying to disappear. He started staying after school with the English teacher who saw in him what others couldn't. He started entering writing contests, local ones at first, then statewide, then national. He didn't win at first. Rejection letters came like clockwork, but he kept them all, pinned them to his corkboard like medals, because every no meant he was still in the fight. I remember one morning, pouring coffee in a kitchen still dark with dawn. He walked in, holding a printed email. He didn't speak, just handed it to me. He'd won a scholarship essay contest, full ride. Georgetown, English and philosophy. I looked at him, standing there barefoot in pajama pants, and I swear he looked taller somehow. Not in inches. In presence, in knowing. But here's the thing about moments like that. They don't erase the past. They echo it. Because when graduation day came, when he stood behind that podium as valedictorian, holding a folded piece of paper and locking eyes with the same teachers who once called him forgettable, He didn't gloat. He didn't brag. He began with this. They laughed when I struggled. They called me fragile, weird, too much, too little. Irananomin, meon. But I wasn't any of those things. I was becoming, and then he told them everything. Not with bitterness, with clarity, with a voice so steady you'd think it never cracked. He spoke of silence, of shame, of how we teach boys that pain must be buried or disguised. He spoke of mothers who stayed up rewriting essays because their sons were too scared to ask for help. He spoke of what it means to rise not with anger, but with purpose. The auditorium wasn't silent anymore. It was listening. Even Kevin stood up. And that moment, it wasn't revenge. It was redemption. Because what they didn't understand was that every insult, every dismissal, every time they rolled their eyes or left him out, it didn't break him. It built him, not because pain is noble, but because he made it useful. He turned it into ink, into words, into a mirror he held up to the very people who once refused to see him. He made them look, and now the world listens. But long before the world started listening, there were nights that nearly broke both of us. Nights where I'd hear the soft sound of him crying behind a locked door and feel utterly helpless on the other side. I couldn't knock. I couldn't fix it with motherly words. Sometimes love is knowing when to stay silent and when to speak up. So I waited. I waited for him to open that door. And when he finally did, he didn't say much. He just leaned into me. And we stood in that hallway like we were the last two people in a world that didn't understand either of us. That kind of pain doesn't go away. It becomes part of the architecture of who you are. But so does love. And my love for Aiden wasn't loud. It didn't wear banners or wave flags. It packed his lunch. It drove him to bookstores. It saved money in secret envelopes for college application fees. It defended him in rooms where he wasn't even mentioned. And when I say he rose, I don't mean he became perfect. I mean he stopped needing their approval. He realized his worth was not up for negotiation. And from that moment on, his voice got steadier, his back straighter, his eyes clearer. They still talked behind our backs. Of course they did. People like Kevin and his wife. People who think their success gives them the right to measure everyone else. They don't change easily. But it didn't matter. Not anymore. Because Aiden had stopped measuring himself by their rulers. He was crafting his own. And now, years later, when people read his essays in The Atlantic or quote his lines in commencement speeches, they see brilliance. They see talent. But they didn't see the journals filled with doubt. They didn't see the trembling hands holding a speech in front of a high school crowd. They didn't see a boy who once believed he had to disappear in order to survive. I did. And now, so do they. I never told Aiden this, but there were nights I prayed not for his success, but for his survival, not in the physical sense, but emotional survival, that he'd make it through high school without losing his sense of self, that he wouldn't internalize the whispers, the comparisons, the absence of praise, that he wouldn't mistake their silence for a verdict. And when I think back to those nights when I see the version of him curled in bed with headphones in, notebook on his chest, eyes darting beneath closed lids like he was dreaming of some place far from here, I realize something. We're not just raising children. We're raising their self-worth. And the way you respond when the world dismisses your child, it matters. It teaches them whether to bow or to build. Aiden built. College was a new world, a breath of fresh air he didn't know he needed. Suddenly, he was surrounded by people who celebrated his thoughts, not just tolerated them. Professors who pulled him aside after lectures. Peers who read his essays and called them moving. A campus lit not just with knowledge, but with curiosity. He thrived there not because it was easy, but because it was honest. And yet, the old wounds lingered. They always do, even in the happiest chapters. The scars hum beneath the surface like a song you thought you forgot. I remember visiting him sophomore year. We were sitting outside a campus cafe, leaves falling around us like confetti. When he said, "Do you think I'm doing okay?" I blinked. Aiden, Manman, you're doing incredible. Why would you even ask that? He smiled softly. Because sometimes I still feel like that kid in the cafeteria, the one who got laughed at just for trying. And that's when it hit me. Success doesn't silence all the echoes. It just helps you speak louder than they do. So I told him the truth. I told him he was more than okay. That his courage, his gentleness, his grit, those were not traits he grew despite adversity. They were carved because of it. And I told him something else, that he made me better, that his resilience taught me how to stop shrinking, that watching him rise gave me permission to look at my own life and ask, who told me I had to stay small? Because this wasn't just his victory, it was ours. There's a moment every parent waits for, not the first steps, not the first words, but the moment your child stands on their own. Not just physically, but spiritually, when they say, "This is who I am," and the world doesn't change them, it listens. Aiden had that moment on a rainy evening in D.C. during a literary panel for first-time published authors. He stood in front of a room of strangers, now readers, holding his debut memoir and shaking hands. A small book with a big truth, the story of a boy they laughed at, who learned to speak anyway. When the moderator asked what the title meant, "The Quiet Ones Make Thunder," Aiden looked out into the crowd, locked eyes with me, and said, "Idran, Tanawashawatim." It means you don't have to be loud to be heard. You just have to be true. The applause that followed was real. Some people stood, not because they knew him, but because they saw him, and maybe that's all any of us want. To be seen. Fully finally. Beyond our wounds, beyond our labels, beyond the limitations others gave us. And as I stood in that room, mother of the boy once mocked for being soft, I thought back to that wrinkled note I packed in his lunchbox years ago. The one that said, "Daughtenmas, Kornderma." They mocked Edison before the light. They called Lincoln awkward before he led. They doubted Walt Disney before he drew. Ifuader terminal. And I smiled. Because now, someone out there was quoting Aiden. And maybe, just maybe, another quiet kid with trembling hands and a notebook heart would hear his words and begin their own. I think about that moment often, the one where Aiden defined his own meaning of thunder. Because we spend so much of our lives waiting for applause, chasing the kind of validation that makes noise. But some victories don't come with fanfare. They come in whispers, in pages, in the gentle silence after a room has been moved by truth. After that panel, things changed. Opportunities came. Invitations followed. Aiden was interviewed, published, praised. But what struck me most wasn't the rise, it was the way he handled it. With a calmness that made people lean in, a humility that made them stay. He hadn't forgotten where he came from. In fact, he wore it like a compass. I remember one morning, about a year after his book release, he came home to visit. We were in the kitchen, cooking breakfast the way we always used to, him slicing strawberries with surgical precision, me flipping pancakes. And out of nowhere, he said, "You know, ik Rhea in Marts. I think I want to go back." Back where? Der Meter. I asked. To my high school. I want to talk to the students. Not as a lecture, just as someone who made it through. I froze for a second, then nodded. They need that. Isher Mari Afudmarn. He smiled, but I saw the weight in his eyes. He wasn't going back for applause. He was going back to offer something we rarely get to give: the story after the storm. A few weeks later, we stood in the same auditorium where he'd once been mocked, dismissed, and overlooked. It looked smaller than I remembered. The paint still chipped near the exits. The same folding chairs, the same stage. But this time, the room was full. Teachers, students, some old faces from our past. Kevin was there too, not invited, but present. Deserts him, silent, watching, and then Aiden stepped forward. No notes. During the turnism, no script. He just looked at them and said, "I don't remember most of your names, but I remember how I felt around you." The room hushed. I remember what it felt like to sit alone at lunch. I remember the nicknames, Wister Wantuanan. I remember trying so hard to be invisible, because being seen meant being hurt. He paused, but I also remember something else. I remember surviving it. I remember growing in the cracks. I remember realizing that being different wasn't a flaw, it was a gift. He told them about the journals. The nights, the doubts, but also about the moments, the teachers who saw him, the librarian who gave him extra books, the kid who once said, "Cool drawing," and didn't know it saved his whole week. And then he said this: "If you're the one being laughed at, keep going. If you feel like no one sees you, keep showing up anyway. Because one day, they'll have to listen, not because you screamed, but because you stayed." I felt the tears before I noticed them. Around me, beside me, even Kevin, head down, motionless. Afterward, a student came up to Aiden. A young girl, weighs a chaperone, shy, shoulders hunched. She said, I didn't think people like us got out. Aiden smiled. We don't get out, we rise. And when we rise, we reach back. She nodded, and I saw it again. That thing that happens when someone feels seen, a flicker of possibility. Later that evening, we sat in the car outside our old house. Aiden stared at the front porch for a long time. I used to sit out there and wonder if I'd ever matter. Sorry, you win. One thing, he said. You've always mattered, I replied. He turned to me. No. I mean, if I'd matter to the world, beyond you, beyond these walls, I wanted to say 1,000 things, but I just took his hand. You matter to the world because you matter to yourself first. And in that moment, everything we had endured made sense. The pain, the silence, the struggle. It wasn't fair. It never is. But it was fuel. And he turned it into something immortal. Because when they laughed at my son's struggles, they didn't realize they were sharpening the very voice that would one day move them. They didn't know they were building a storm. But I did. And now, they all hear the thunder. There's a kind of justice the world doesn't talk about. It doesn't come with lawsuits or headlines. It doesn't show up in handcuffs or courtroom verdicts. It shows up quietly, in dignity reclaimed, in the soft power of someone choosing not to harden in the face of cruelty. That's the revenge that lasts longer than any spotlight. The life built in defiance of what they said you'd never become. Aiden didn't need them to say sorry. He didn't need validation from the very voices that once denied him. What he needed and what he claimed was the ability to walk back into a room that tried to erase him and take up space anyway. That's the power of someone who knows who they are. Months passed. His second book came out. This time it was fiction. But like all great fiction, it was laced with truth. It followed a boy named Callum, raised in a town where difference was seen as disease. Critics called it haunting, staggering, a punch in the gut dressed as prose. It debuted at number 3 on the bestseller list. Aiden didn't celebrate with a party. He sent a thank you note to his high school librarian instead. Some people rise with fireworks. My son rose like the tide, unstoppable, subtle, irrefutable. Then one morning, I opened my inbox to a message I never expected. It was from Kevin. Subject line, about Aiden. I hesitated before opening it. My stomach churned. Over the years, Kevin had softened, but only in the way rocks do when time wears them down. Not because they chose to. The message was short. I watched the interview. He's remarkable. I didn't see it before. I see it now. I'm sorry. There was no punctuation after sorry. And somehow that made it feel even more raw, unfinished. Like it had taken everything in him to hit send before he could second guess it. I sat there for a long time. And then I closed the message. Not out of anger, out of peace. Because the story wasn't about Kevin. It never was. It was about the boy they underestimated. And the man who never needed their permission to become something more. Aiden kept writing. He taught workshops. He mentored kids who didn't have voices yet. He traveled to schools, prisons, community centers, not as a savior, but as a mirror. He told his story not to be applauded, but to remind others that endurance itself is a form of genius. And through it all, he never once raised his voice. He didn't need to, because when you live your truth out loud, even whispers sound like thunder. I still have that first journal of his, the one he kept under the mattress. I read it sometimes when I forget how far we've come. One entry stands out. If one day I matter, I want to matter quietly. Not because they finally cheered, but because I kept going when no one clapped. He wrote that at 15, and today, strangers quote him. Teachers assign him. Kids with trembling hands write him letters saying, I thought I was alone. And every time that happens, I remember that pale gray sky, that bloodied lip, that silent walk home, and I smile. Because they laughed at my son's struggles, but he turned their laughter into literature, their doubt into dialogue, their silence into symphonies. And that is how you win. Not by shouting, not by proving, but by being unshakably, unapologetically, unforgettably. You run a